In this video, we are going to be looking at the press, the newspapers, and the fight for freedom of speech and expression. The fight for freedom from British rule began not with rebellions and revolts, not with violence on the streets, nor non-violent mass campaigns. It had its humble beginnings with the fight for the freedom of press, the fight for the freedom of speech, and the fight for freedom of expression. As it was in the early 19th century, once again, it was Rajaram Mohan Roy who, as early as 1824, protested against a regulation restricting the freedom of press. In his eloquent self, he addressed to the Supreme Court in a memorandum highlighting the needs for the freedom of speech and press. Quoting Roy, every good ruler will be anxious to afford every individual the readiest means of bringing to his notice whatever may influence his interference. To secure this important object, the unrestricted liberty of publication is the only effectual means that can be employed. This is what Roy said, and this was in the 1800s, that is in the 19th century. As discussed before, through the decades between 1870 and 1920, political propaganda, politicization of the masses, and formation of nationalist ideology took the center stage. The press was the chief instrument for carrying out this task. Nearly a third of the founding fathers of the Indian National Congress in 1885 were journalists. One third of the founding fathers were journalists in 1885. So you can understand what an important role press played and why the British would have wanted to curb the freedom of the press, which they tried to do quite a few times. But this was one area that the initial congressmen fought very hard for, that is the freedom of press and the freedom of speech, because without the newspapers they could never have reached the masses. So it was during this period that major newspapers took birth and flourished. The Hindu and Swadeshi Mitran under G. Subramanya Iyer, Kesari and Maharatta under Lokamanya Balagangadhar Tilak, Bengali under Surendranath Banerjee, Amar Bazar Patrika under Shishir Kumar Ghosh and Motilal Ghosh, Sudharak under Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Indian Mirror under N.N. Sen, Voice of India under Dadabai, Hindustani and Advocate under G.P. Verma, Tribune and Akbar-e-Am in Punjab, Indu Prakash, Dhyan Prakash, Kal and Gujarati in Bombay, Som Prakash, Banga Nivasi and Sadharani in Bengal. So these were all popular newspapers in India in the late 19th century, right? So you can see how many newspapers have been listed. So India has always had a number of languages and a number of publications in every language. This does not exist across the world. This is one of the major features of our independence movement. There hardly existed a major political leader in India who did not possess a newspaper or was not writing for one in some capacity or the other, because newspapers were the only way you could reach masses at that point in time. Each of these newspapers was nationalist in nature. Oppose, oppose, oppose was the motto of the Indian press. Newspapers were not business enterprises. It was looked upon as a national or social services. To be a journalist was often to be a political worker and an agitator at considerable self-sacrifice. But it wasn't too expensive to start a newspaper in those days. Of course, the editor or the journalist had to live at semi-starvation levels or earn his livelihood through alternate means. Amar Bazar Patrika was started in 1868 with printing equipment purchased for rupees 32. Surendranath Banerjee purchased the goodwill of the Bengali in 1879 for 10 rupees and the press for another 1600 rupees. Dufferin, the viceroy in 1886, was already beginning to get concerned about the role the press was playing in the rising nationalist consciousness. Dufferin says, day after day, hundreds of sharp witted babus pour forth their indignation against the English oppressors in very pungent and effective diatribe. In this way, there can be no doubt there is generated in the minds of those who read these papers a sincere conviction that we are the enemies of mankind in general and of Indians in particular. Dufferin was already scared of the role the press was played, and he was right in doing so. Arousing political consciousness, to inculcate nationalism, to expose colonial rule, and to preach disloyalty was no easy task. Since 1870, there existed Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, according to which whoever attempts to excite feelings of disaffection to the government established by law in British India was to be punished with transportation for life or any term or with imprisonment up to 3 years. So, what Section 124A says is that either you would be jailed for a time of 3 years, or you may be transported out of the country for life. So this was Section 124A, and this was, of course, in some way connected to the Vernacular Press Act. This clause was later supplemented by even more stricter measures, but the Indian journalists proved too smart for the British, for they used clever stratagems and evolved a distinctive style of writing to remain outside the rule of law. The British government could not harm anyone who professed loyalty to Queen Victoria, and hence the diatribe was often in the form of advice to the British government in India, asking them to get their act straight while actually chiding them for their oppressive regime and rule. Lokamanya and Motilal Ghosh were experts at this form of writing. Some of the more daring writers took recourse to irony, puns, sarcasm, banter, mock seriousness, and burlesque. Anti imperialist extracts from London based socialist or Irish newspapers or letters from radical British citizens were published. The Indian journalists knew that no action could be taken against them without similar action being taken against British citizens in Britain. It was no easy task to be an effective journalist in those days. Simplicity had to be combined with subtlety. Simplicity to educate a semi-literate public, and subtlety to convey the true meaning without falling foul of the law. These were the challenges that were being faced by the journalists in the late 19th century. The press, the freedom of press, the freedom of speech were the pillars upon which the early Indian national movement would be built on. The same would be continued by Lokamanya Tilak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and Gandhi in the years to come. This concludes the video. Thank you.